I returned home at exactly 2:19 in the morning, the kind of winter hour in Minnesota when the cold clings to your jacket and follows you inside like an unwanted shadow. My scrubs were stiff with dried sanitizer, and the faint lavender scent from the nursing home lingered on my sleeves, a soft reminder of the world I wished I could stay in. The house was silent except for the thin gold glow coming from the kitchen, a single light left on deliberately. My stomach tightened because my brother only left that light on when he was awake and waiting. And waiting never meant patience. The moment I stepped inside, I kept everything quiet, easing the door shut, slipping out of my shoes, placing my keys on the counter without a sound. I prayed he had fallen asleep on the couch, but hope in this house had always been a fragile thing. Then a glass fell. The sharp break cut through the stillness water, spreading across the tile like a warning. A shard skidded toward my foot. My breath caught as he emerged from the shadows near the hallway, tall and silent, shoulders wide enough to block the entire doorway, eyes carrying the flat coldness of someone who had been awake for hours rehearsing every imagined insult I had committed simply by existing. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low and coiled instead of loud. That quiet tone always hurt more than shouting. I told him I had taken an extra call light at work because a resident needed help. My voice was even careful, soft enough not to strike the air wrong. He closed the distance between us in 2 steps. Before I could react, his hand hit my cheek with a sound that cracked the room open. The blow sent me sideways into the counter, pain shooting from my jaw to my shoulder. I tasted copper but swallowed it because reacting only made things worse. A quiet flashback hit me without warning. I was 14 the first time he hit me. I did not remember the full scene, only sensations. The room spinning, the breath leaving my body in one violent collapse. The terrible silence afterward, the kind that filled your ears like water, thick and heavy. My mother had stood in the doorway that day, one hand holding her coffee mug, watching without urgency. "Do not provoke your brother," she had said. "He is your blood." Her voice returned now in perfect clarity, as if she were whispering it beside me. My brother grabbed the collar of my scrub top and yanked me forward, slamming me against the table. The plates rattled. I kept my eyes down, not out of fear, but because looking up had always escalated him. Looking up meant defiance. Looking up meant another hit. Footsteps approached, and my mother appeared, tightening her robe as if she had been disturbed from peaceful sleep instead of awakened by violence. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not step toward me. She went straight to him, placing a hand on his shoulder like she was guiding a misunderstood child. "I told you she would come home late again," she said. "Why do you always start things?" My cheek throbbed. My side burned. The accusation sat between us like a familiar piece of furniture. Start things. I stared at the floor tile, at a crack in the grout near my foot, focusing on anything but their faces. My mother crossed her arms and sighed. "You know how stressed he is. Why can you not be more thoughtful? Why must you always push him?" Her tone carried that generational script worn smooth from repetition. I felt something shift inside me, not rage, not fear, but a widening, a quiet space opening in my chest. My brother tossed the broken glass into the sink, each piece hitting the metal with sharp clatters meant to intimidate. My mother turned away as if the matter was settled, and I was the one who needed to calm down. My cheek burned under my fingertips. The bruise would deepen by morning. I knew the colors by now, the way they spread across my skin like unwelcome flowers. But for the first time, the bruise did not scare me. The silence grew heavier, weighted with something unspoken. I lifted my gaze just enough to see their silhouettes under the kitchen light. The enforcer and the protector. The hitter and the excuser. A cycle older than I was. A cycle older than my mother. A cycle that had swallowed women in my family long before I learned to walk. I inhaled slowly, even though my ribs made it difficult. I said nothing. Not because I agreed and not because I was afraid. I stayed silent because this time silence was not surrender. Silence was preparation. It was the first quiet step in a plan I had been forming piece by piece without fully realizing it. a plan that would end at dawn. And dawn was only a few hours away. I woke up late in the morning with a slow ache spreading through my cheek and ribs, the kind of pain that made every breath feel like it had to pass through memory before reaching my lungs. I sat on the edge of the bed, eyes half open, and let the familiar heaviness settle in my chest. It was not just from last night. It was from years of being told in quiet ways and loud ways that my place in this family was lower, smaller, easier to blame. The sunlight slipping through the curtains felt too gentle for the reality of the house. But it reminded me of how far back the pattern went. It did not start with my brother. It did not even start with my mother. It stretched back like roots under the floorboards. I remembered one afternoon when I was 12 flipping through old photo albums in the living room while my mother sorted laundry. I noticed how every picture fit the same pattern. My brother, in the center of every group, shot smiling easily, soaking in all the attention. My mother beside him, her hand on his shoulder. My father taking the pictures. And me on the edge. Always at the edge. Half cropped out in several photos. Too far to the side to look like part of the moment. That was the first time I asked why. My mother did not even look up when she said, "You were just shy." But I remembered the truth. I was shy because I learned early there was no space made for me. My mother had grown up the same way. I learned that later almost by accident. I was 17 when she told me a piece of it. She was in the kitchen stirring soup, her movements tired, and she said, "Your grandmother only loved your uncle." She said it with a laugh, but not the funny kind. The laugh that hides bitterness in the back of the throat. I asked her if she ever confronted my grandmother. To this day, I remember the exact silence she gave me before answering. "No point," she said. "Some things just are." But she did not break the cycle. She fed it. She sharpened it. She carved my brother into the favored one the same way her mother had carved her brother. I became the tool, the excuse, the one held to a higher standard but valued less. A memory came back to me, a ghost memory I had pushed down for years. It was Thanksgiving maybe 10 years ago. I had woken up early to help my mother cook. My brother had stumbled downstairs late complaining he was tired, and my mother had smiled at him with all the softness she never gave me. She had handed me the bowl and said, "Help me finish this. Let him rest." It was always let him rest. Let him cool down. Let him process. Let him grow. Let him be. And for me, it was, "You should help more. You should not upset him. You should try harder." I grew up learning that I had to be small so he could be big. That line settled in my bones even before I knew how to name it. My father never intervened. He was quiet in a way that felt like absence more than peace. He watched things happen and turned away. Years later, when I asked him why he never stepped in, he answered with the same generational script. "Boys are like that. Do not take things so seriously." His words felt like he was repeating something he had heard from his own father. A chain passed down without thought. My grandmother had worshipped her son. My mother worshipped hers, and somehow they both expected me to understand that this was natural, that my place in this hierarchy was not cruelty, but tradition. The cruelest traditions are always the ones wrapped in family pride. I remembered another moment, small but sharp, when I was 15. We were decorating the Christmas tree. My brother hung the star my mother clapped proudly, and she told him, "You have always been the center of this family." She said it warmly, kindly, lovingly. Then she turned to me and said, "You are better at helping. Can you hand him the next ornament?" I felt like a background character in my own home. Even at school events, my mother always sat up front for my brother. For me, she arrived late and left early, saying quietly, "You know I am proud of you even if I do not say it." But she did say things. She said them through actions, through excuses, through silences that weighed more than words. The favoritism was not a moment. It was a structure, a house built long before I was born, reinforced every year, and I had been living inside it like someone too polite to break a window and escape. When people talk about toxic families, they imagine screaming threats, dramatic scenes. But the worst part is the quiet, the everyday expectations, the slow shaping of who matters and who does not. I realized something as I sat on my bed, rubbing the bruise on my cheek. I had inherited not just their blood, but their history. And I was the first woman in 3 generations who could see the pattern clearly instead of mistaking it for love. That clarity settled deep in my chest, warm and steady. The cycle did not start with me, but it could end with me. I stood from the bed, slowly wincing at the pull in my ribs, and walked toward the door. The house felt smaller now, the walls closing in the echoes of old generations whispering through the hallway. I paused at the top of the staircase and placed my hand on the railing that my grandmother had once polished and my mother had once clung to. I whispered softly to myself, not as a plea, but as a vow. This ends today. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of careful movements and measured breaths. Every step reminded me of the bruise blooming under my ribs, a deep ache that pulsed with each inhale. I moved slowly through the hallway, not because of the pain, but because the house itself felt watchful. The patterns of my family's history pressed against me from every direction, and for the first time I was not shrinking beneath them. I was studying them. I spent the next several minutes in the bathroom, the one with the dim yellow light that always made me look more tired than I felt. I lifted my shirt and saw the bruise forming a wide shadow across my side. It was tender, but not surprising. Patterns always repeat with precision. I pressed a cold cloth against it, wincing only slightly. The cold grounded me. It reminded me that I had a body that deserved safety, even if my family had never treated it that way. As I stared at my reflection, something inside me clicked softly into place, almost audibly. Not a spark of rage. Not a collapse of fear. More like a lock sliding an internal decision I had unknowingly been building toward for years. I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking, but not from panic. They were steadying themselves into a new kind of strength. I opened the camera and took several photos of the bruise, making sure the timestamp was visible in the corner. Then I used the mirror to capture my cheek where the swelling had darkened. I took a short video too, my voice low as I stated the date, the time, and what had happened. It felt surreal at first, documenting something that had happened countless times, but had only lived in my memory until now. I whispered quietly, "This is not fear. This is evidence." A quiet flashback drifted over me, soft and uninvited. I was 16, sitting at the edge of my bed, lifting my hair to check the mark on my neck from where my brother had shoved me into the wall after taking the remote from him. My mother had entered the room and sighed as if I were being dramatic. She dabbed concealer on the bruise, brushing my hair to cover it. "You will be fine," she said. "Do not embarrass us." The memory dissolved just as quickly as it came. But this time, instead of swallowing it like I always had, I felt it fuel something quiet and steady in my stomach. I returned to the present and sent the photos and video to my closest friend Mark. He had been a police officer for 7 years and had seen enough to recognize danger without needing every detail. I typed a message with deliberate calm. "I am not calling anyone yet. I just want this logged." His response came instantly. "Do you need help?" I hesitated, then typed, "Not yet. I need mourning. I need witnesses." He replied with a single word. "Understood." The word sank into me like a promise. I tucked the phone away, exhaling slowly. For years, I had believed that survival meant staying silent, but survival could also mean planning. Surviving could mean noticing the cracks in the structure and knowing exactly when to push. My brother was still asleep, or maybe pretending to be. Either way, the house was quiet again, and quiet had always been my space to think. I walked into the kitchen and cleaned the broken glass he had thrown earlier, not because it was my responsibility, but because I needed the floor clear. I needed the space neutral. My mother had left early, heading to her job at the bank without checking on me. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not apologize. She simply stepped around the tension, the same way she stepped around spilled salt, acting like ignoring it made it disappear. When she closed the door behind her, I felt a shift in the air. The house was briefly mine. I opened the windows just enough to feel the air move through the curtains. The early cold stung my skin and helped me think more clearly. I placed my hands flat on the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent years serving holiday meals while my brother lounged in the living room. This time, my hands did not tremble. I replayed everything that had happened the night before and everything that had happened over the past decade. A pattern, a progression, a predictable escalation. My brother always lost control at night. He always calmed down by midday. He always expected forgiveness by evening, and by morning he always rewrote the story so he became the victim. That was the part I focused on. Morning was his weakness because he never expected anyone to see him clearly. But morning was also when the world woke up, when people walked dogs, when neighbors opened blinds, when delivery drivers passed by, when witnesses existed. I whispered quietly, "Morning is my strength." I made coffee even though my hands ached and sat at the table with the cup warming my palms. I opened the phone and looked at the images again, not to torture myself but to ground myself. These were facts, evidence, proof strong enough to pierce through the layers of denial my family lived inside. I drafted one more message to Mark. "If someone calls about this address today, just verify the record. I will handle the rest." His response was short. "Got you." I felt a slow exhale leave my chest. Not relief, not yet, but direction, purpose, a plan forming like frost on glass. The night before had broken something, but not me. It had broken my tolerance. It had broken the silence I had carried for years. And as I stood by the window watching the first hint of dawn touch the rooftops, I felt something steady rise inside me. Clarity. Cold. Certain. This was the night I stopped surviving and started calculating. And dawn was moving closer. By the time the first threads of dawn stretched across the sky, the entire house felt suspended in a thin, trembling quiet. Not the dangerous quiet from the night before, but a quiet that hummed with purpose. The kind of quiet that comes right before a storm begins to rearrange everything in its path. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, the cold tile grounding me as I moved through each step of my morning with deliberate calm. My ribs still ached when I lifted my arm, but pain no longer felt like a threat. It felt like proof that I had endured, and that morning had finally arrived for me instead of for him. The old kettle hissed a soft whistle as I heated water for tea. I did not need the tea, but I needed the routine. Something about the ritual steadied my breathing, keeping me from drifting into the fog of fear that used to take over on mornings after a bad night. I set out 3 plates on the counter. One for my mother, who would return soon from picking up pastries from the corner store as she did every Saturday. One for my brother, who would wake up late, convinced that the world owed him gentleness because of how hard life had supposedly been on him. And one for myself. For the first time in years, I did not place my plate off to the side. I put it directly beside my mother's, a quiet act of reclaiming space in a kitchen where I had always been an afterthought. When the eggs finished cooking, I filled the plates evenly. No smaller serving for myself, no larger portion for him. Balance. That word echoed in my chest with surprising strength. Balance, the thing our family had never known, not for 3 generations of women who had learned to bend until they could no longer recognize their own shape. I heard my mother's car pull into the driveway. She always parked close to the garage door, even though there was plenty of space. She liked to be the first one inside. She liked control. The sound of her keys jingling reached me before the door opened. She stepped in, carrying a small paper bag from the bakery, and froze briefly when she saw me standing at the stove. "You are up early," she said, her voice laced with an edge of suspicion, as if waking up before my brother were somehow a crime in our family. I kept my tone steady. "Breakfast is ready." Her eyes flicked to the plates, noticing that mine was not off to the side as usual. Instead of saying anything, she simply set the pastry bag down and began sorting the mail as if reorganizing envelopes were more important than acknowledging the bruise she had surely noticed on my cheek. I had stopped expecting her to ask about it years ago. Behind us, the old floor vent rattled in the hallway. My brother was waking up. That vent always rattled when he walked past it, a small warning system I had relied on since childhood. His footsteps were heavy today, dragging the way they always were after he had unleashed his temper the night before. My mother glanced toward the hallway and said automatically, "Make your brother a plate." He did not sleep well. The old script, the same lines passed down through generations. She had not even realized I already had a plate waiting for him. Her mind was still stuck in the pattern where I served and he received. When I did not move, she finally looked at the plates, confusion briefly breaking through her usual certainty. I held her gaze without apology. It was a small confrontation, but it landed in the room like a crack splitting across glass. She opened her mouth to correct me, but before she could, something outside caught my attention. A quiet hum. A slow, rolling sound. I moved to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the street. A police cruiser was parked at the far end of the block, not close enough to alarm the house, not far enough to go unnoticed by me. My breath stayed steady. This was not fear. This was confirmation. Mark had done exactly what I expected. He had placed the morning where it needed to be. Watching. Waiting. My mother followed my gaze and stiffened. "Why is there a police car outside?" she whispered. Her voice had lost its practiced confidence. I let the curtain fall and turned back to the stove. Probably nothing I said calmly. But she kept watching me, suspicion and unease twisting together in her eyes. She sensed the shift. Not the police car itself, but the calmness in my voice. The absence of apology. The lack of fear. My brother entered the kitchen, then still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped when he saw me and the bruise on my cheek. His face went tight, defensive, angry, threatened. He scanned the kitchen looking for something to blame, something to control, something to twist back on me. I met his eyes for the first time in hours, steady, unmoving. "Morning," I said. The word landed between us like a marker in the sand. A new boundary drawn. His jaw twitched. My mother looked between us, panic rising in her expression, because she sensed that whatever had governed this household for decades was no longer doing its job. She tried to reassert control by stepping closer to him. "Your sister did not mean anything last night. She gets emotional. She always exaggerates." The script again. The same worn justification. But this time I did not shrink beneath it. I placed my hand on the edge of the table and said quietly, "This ends today." My mother stared at me as if she did not recognize the person speaking. My brother's expression darkened. The dawn light through the window sharpened every angle of the moment. And somewhere outside, the cruiser remained still and watchful. The morning was in position. My silence had set the stage. All that was left now was for the world to step inside the house that had been protected by secrecy for far too long. The knock on the door came at exactly 7:14 in the morning, sharp enough to slice through the tension that had been building in the kitchen. My mother flinched so hard, the spoon in her hand clattered against the counter. My brother froze mid-step, his face tightening as if the knock itself were a personal attack. I stayed completely still, my hand resting lightly on the table, the same way someone might steady themselves before watching a long-awaited truth unfold. The knock came again. Firm, measured, official. My mother hurried toward the door, panic making her movements jerky. She smoothed her robe, glanced at me once with a silent warning, then pulled the door open. The bright winter sunlight spilled across the floor, and standing in it were two uniformed officers and a community safety officer holding a clipboard. Their presence filled the doorway like a wall. "Good morning, ma'am," one of them said. "We received a call to check on the well-being of the residents here." My mother's face crumpled into the kind of nervous smile she used whenever authority figures appeared. "Oh, this must be a mistake," she said quickly, too quickly. "We are perfectly fine." The officer stepped just slightly forward, not enough to breach the threshold, but enough to assert presence. "We had reports of shouting and impact noises late last night, and again, early this morning." My mother's smile faltered. She looked back at me and I could see the exact moment she realized I was calm. Too calm. Calm in the way a person becomes when they finally know they are safe enough to stop pretending. She turned back to the officers. "My son had a rough night," she said. "My daughter overreacts sometimes. She tends to be emotional." It was the same script she had used my entire life, polished by generations of mothers who protected their golden sons and sacrificed their daughters to keep the peace. Before she could continue, the officer asked, "Is everyone present?" "We need to visually confirm." My mother's voice cracked for the first time. "Of course. Yes. We are all here. Come in." She stepped aside. The officers entered with quiet professionalism, their presence steady and unhurried. My brother stiffened where he stood near the kitchen doorway. He tried to square his shoulders, tried to look indifferent, tried to look like a reasonable man caught in an unreasonable situation, but the bruises on my face were visible in the morning light, and nothing he could do would erase that. One officer stopped a few feet from me and asked gently, "Are you all right?" The softness in his voice almost undid me. I had heard screaming, accusations, minimization, blame. But gentleness from a stranger felt foreign and overwhelming. I nodded slowly. My ribs ached with the movement. He studied my face. "May I ask what happened?" Before I could answer, my brother snapped. "She falls. She is clumsy. She bumps into things. She always does this." The officer did not even look at him. That was the first moment my brother faltered. He was used to being the center of every room, the sun, everything else revolved around. Having someone refuse to acknowledge him carved confusion across his features. The officer kept his eyes on me. "If you need medical attention or to step outside to speak privately, we can arrange that." My mother cut in sharply. "She does not need anything. She is making this bigger than it is. She always creates drama. This is a family matter." Family matter. The phrase had been used my entire life to silence me, to contain me, to shame me back into the shadows. But words lose their power once the truth is in the room with badges and authority behind it. The second officer stepped toward my brother. "Sir, if you do not mind, we need to ask where you were last night around 2 in the morning." My brother's jaw tightened. "I was asleep." The officer raised a brow. The neighbor reported hearing a loud impact and what sounded like someone hitting furniture. My brother swallowed, and for the first time I saw fear flicker across his face. Not fear of causing harm, fear of being seen. He always counted on the darkness, on closed doors, on silence. Mourning was not his ally. My mother tried to intercept the questioning. "My son works long hours. He gets stressed. He did not hurt anyone." She said it with desperation that clung to every syllable. The officer turned to her. "Mom, we need you to step aside. This is a safety check." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at me again, pleading this time as if I held the power to restore the old hierarchy by simply staying quiet. But silence no longer belonged to them. The officer nearest to my brother asked him again, "Sir, we are going to need to see your hands." My brother hesitated too long. And that was all it took. In that brief pause, every lie he had ever relied on collapsed beneath the weight of what was visible in the morning light. The officer reached for his cuffs. "Sir, place your hands behind your back." My brother's face drained of color. His eyes darted to me as if I had betrayed him, as if survival were betrayal. He opened his mouth, but no excuses came out. His voice failed under the weight of truth. My mother gasped. "They cannot arrest him. Tell them it was nothing. Tell them you fall." I stood there steady as if rooted into the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply said, "I am safe." And for the first time in my life, the room responded to my truth instead of his. The officers guided him toward the door. He was frozen, unable to mask his arrogance with charm or anger. He had never been seen in daylight before. My mother reached out toward him, but the officer gently blocked her. "Ma'am, please stand back." My brother looked at me one last time, stunned and wordless, as he was led outside into the morning that had finally chosen someone other than him. And in the silence he left behind, I felt my first breath of real freedom. The shelter sat on the edge of town, tucked between an old brick library and a church with white wooden steps that creaked under every footfall. The building looked small from the outside, almost unassuming, but as soon as I walked through the front door, the warmth wrapped around me like a blanket. I did not realize I had been missing my entire life. The air smelled faintly of detergent and fresh coffee, and the lights were soft enough not to sting my eyes after the morning's chaos. A woman at the check-in desk glanced up and offered a gentleness I was not used to receiving. "You must be Lena," she said quietly. "We were told you might come in today." Her voice was calm, no urgency, no judgment, no suspicion hiding beneath polite words. For a moment, I could not respond. My throat tightened, not from sorrow, but from the sudden shock of being in a place where no one demanded I explain myself. She led me to a small intake room with pale blue walls and a window that overlooked a fenced garden. The chair she gestured toward was cushioned soft enough to feel foreign beneath me. She sat across from me with a clipboard resting lightly in her lap. "I should ask the usual questions," she said, "but you can pause any time you need." I nodded. I answered mechanically at first. Name, age, employment, if I had children, if I had somewhere safe to go after. Then she asked, "Has this happened before?" The question sat in the room like a held breath. I opened my mouth to say the automatic lie. No, just once. But the truth rose instead, quiet but solid. Yes, many times. She did not flinch, did not scribble faster on the paper, did not widen her eyes in pity. She simply nodded the way a person nods when they already understand more than what is being spoken. "Would you like to talk about it?" she asked. I thought I did not. I thought all I wanted was a bed and silence. But something inside me loosened the way a knot finally gives after years of being pulled tight. Memories drifted in like fog curling through a doorway. Not scenes, not images, feelings. I told her about the first time my brother hit me when I was 14, the way the room spun, the way my breath disappeared, the way my mother whispered, "Do not provoke him," while ignoring the bruise blooming across my skin. I told her about the cycles, the apologies that never came, the way my mother taught me to take responsibility for the violence done to me because that was what her mother had done to her. I told her about the quiet way favoritism shaped the entire house, how my brother never washed a dish, how I served every holiday meal while he complained from the couch, how my mother had once said, "Your brother has more pressure. You must make things easier for him." The counselor listened without speaking, except for small, soft acknowledgments that kept me grounded. I expected her to ask why I had put up with it for so long, but she did not. Instead, she said, "It sounds like no one protected you." That sentence cracked something open inside me. Not in a painful way, more like a window opening after years of stale air. She wrote something on the page, then asked, "Do you have anyone outside your family who supports you?" I hesitated before saying Mark, a friend. He is the first person who ever made me feel like my safety mattered." That seemed to matter to her. She slid a brochure toward me, then paused. "No pressure," she said. "Just options, safety planning, legal information, emotional support." I nodded again. I could not take in everything yet, but knowing there were choices felt like standing under real sunlight for the first time. After we finished the intake, she walked me down a hallway lined with quiet bedrooms. Some doors were closed. From behind one, I heard the soft hum of a lullaby. From another, the muffled sound of someone crying. The counselor paused at an open room. "You can stay here," she said. "There is a lock on the door and no one will enter without your permission." I stepped inside. The room was simple. A single bed with a quilt in shades of green and cream. A small dresser. A window that looked out at the church's bell tower. I sat on the bed and felt the mattress give beneath me in a way that almost made me weep. I had not realized how tense I had been until that moment. My body had been holding its breath for years. The counselor put a bottle of water on the nightstand and said, "Rest. You are safe here. Safe." I repeated the words silently as she left the room and closed the door with a soft click. I stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle around me. Not heavy like the quiet at home, but gentle, like a hand resting on your shoulder. For the first time in years, I lay down without bracing for footsteps in the hallway, without listening for a door slam, without waiting for my name to be shouted in anger. I pulled the quilt over my shoulders. My ribs still hurt. My cheek still throbbed. But the ache felt distant, muted by the warmth of the room. I exhaled slowly, and my body finally understood it could stop fighting. It could just exist. I closed my eyes and drifted into sleep. 6 uninterrupted hours. The longest sleep of my adult life. The first voicemail came less than 3 hours after I woke up in the shelter, my body still heavy from the unfamiliar luxury of uninterrupted sleep. I saw the missed call notification before I even fully opened my eyes. The number was blocked, but I knew exactly who it was. My brother had always hidden behind shadows. The voicemail icon blinked insistently, and dread slid cold across my skin as I pressed play. His voice filled the small room low and venomous. "You think running away fixes anything," he said. "You think hiding makes you safe. You think the cops can protect you forever." His voice cracked on the last word, not from sadness, but from rage. Rage rooted in entitlement. Rage sharpened by the shattering of control. The message ended with a long exhale, the kind that used to mean danger was coming. I set the phone down slowly. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from recognition. This was the retaliation phase, the phase every survivor warned others about. The period between exposure and consequence when the abuser feels their power slipping and claws at anything they can reach. I inhaled deeply and exhaled even deeper until my body stopped trying to fold in on itself. A second voicemail arrived before I even stood up. I did not need to listen. I deleted it. In the hallway outside my room, I could hear distant footsteps, soft voices, the faint buzz of the front desk phone. The shelter was awake, alive, a world moving forward while another part of my world burned behind me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. "You are ruining this family. You always have. You always will." A picture message followed. My childhood bedroom door, the one at my mother's house. The doorknob scratched, the frame splintered. The caption read, "Think I will find you." My heart lurched, but my mind stayed steady. I recognized the tactic: fear by suggestion, intimidation by proximity. That picture could have been taken yesterday or years ago, but he wanted me to believe he was close, that he could get closer. Mark texted shortly after. "Are you okay? There is movement around your mother's house. Someone is pacing by the porch. Likely him. Stay where you are. Safe location only." My legs felt weak for a moment. Not from panic, but from the sudden understanding that this time I was not alone. Someone was watching out for me. Someone was tracking danger instead of dismissing it. I typed back, "I am safe." Then added, "Thank you." My fingers hovered over the screen afterward, struck by how foreign those two words felt. Gratitude. Safety. I had never been allowed to feel either. The shelter staff invited me to a short group meeting around noon. I almost stayed in my room exhausted from the storm unfolding through my phone, but something inside me said, "Go." The meeting room was small with folding chairs arranged in a loose circle and sunlight spilling through tall windows. A woman named Kara with a soft southern accent and eyes that carried the weight of 10 quiet wars led the group. When she asked if anyone wanted to share, I listened as others spoke. There was a woman whose husband stalked her for months before a restraining order finally stuck. Another who escaped with her daughter after years of hidden bruises. Their stories were different, but the pattern was the same. Retaliation, escalation, entitlement, fear followed by clarity. And then, finally, intervention. When they finished, Kara looked at me gently. "You do not have to talk," she said. "But you can, if you want." I surprised myself by speaking. "It started when I was 14, I said. "My brother." Then the words spilled out like water through a crack in a dam. The favoritism, the silence, the cycles, the morning the officers came, the safety I felt for the first time in years. And now, the retaliation. Kara listened with the kind of stillness that felt like protection. When I finished, she said softly, "He is reacting to losing control. That is not your burden to manage." The room hummed with understanding. I nodded, absorbing her words like heat. After the meeting, I checked my phone again. Another message. Different number. Same rage. "You think they will listen to you in court? They know how you lie. They know you exaggerate." I exhaled slowly and let the truth settle across my mind like a weighted blanket. He was unraveling. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because for the first time in his life, someone had seen his actions in daylight. I blocked the number without hesitation. A few minutes later, another call came. Unknown. I let it ring. At the same time, the shelter coordinator knocked lightly on my door. "You have someone asking for you," she said. "A man. He will not give his name. He said he knows you. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed. Does he match this description I asked, describing my brother in exact detail? She frowned. No. He is older. Tall. Quiet voice. Asked for you by your first name only. My breath steadied. Mark. I nodded. Let him in the main area. I will come out. When I stepped into the lobby, Mark was standing near the reception desk, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, his expression serious but calm. He waited until I approached and said, He has been circling your mother's street. He knows you are gone. I felt my pulse rise, but not from fear, from clarity. Mark continued, He will escalate before he gives up, but he will not get near you. We are documenting everything. His tone carried no doubt, just certainty. And certainty was something I had never been offered before. When he left, I returned to my room and sat on the bed, letting the weight of the day settle around me. My brother's rage, his desperation, his unraveling, all of it was predictable. All of it was the retaliation loop survivors warned about. But I was no longer trapped in the loop. I had stepped outside it, and I was watching him spin in circles while I finally stood still, safe, grounded, ready. The cycle was breaking, and he knew it. The next morning, the winter air bit at my cheeks as I walked toward the EMS station, the familiar red brick building standing solid against the gray sky. I had barely slept not because of fear, but because my mind was sharpening itself, pulling every fragment of memory and preparation into a steady, focused rhythm. The retaliation loop was still unfolding, but I was not running anymore. I was moving forward. When I pushed open the side door, the warm smell of coffee and disinfectant rushed toward me, a scent I normally found comforting. Today, it felt like armor. My coworkers were already gathering near the bay doors, some chatting, some preparing equipment. I kept my head down, but I felt the weight of my bruise pulling their eyes toward me. No one asked yet. They would, but not yet. I walked to my locker, spinning the dial with a practiced hand. The metal clicked open. Inside hung my uniform vest, my supplies, and a note taped to the door from my partner Jenna. Here for you. Whatever you need. No questions. My throat tightened at the quiet kindness. I slipped the vest over my shoulders and inhaled slowly. I was ready to face the day. I was not ready for what happened next. The bay doors screeched open. Cold air blasted into the room, and then a voice I knew too well echoed through the garage. You think you can hide from me here? My brother stepped inside, shoulders squared in a way that pretended confidence but barely hid the panic in his eyes. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on me. There you are, he said, his voice rising. You think you can ruin my life and walk away. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Tools dropped. Coffee cups paused halfway to mouths. The entire garage froze as every EMT turned to look at him, then at me. My stomach tightened, but I did not move. He stepped forward, rage blazing through him like a fuse burning too fast. You called the cops on me. You humiliated me. You think they will believe you in court. You think anyone here will believe you. His voice cracked with a mix of desperation and fury. My coworkers exchanged looks. None of them knew the details, but they recognized danger. EMS workers see patterns. They read body language the way most people read newspapers. Nobody laughed. Nobody shrugged it off. Nobody assumed he was harmless. The supervisor on duty, a tall man named Grant with decades of experience, stepped forward and raised a hand. Sir, you cannot be here. You need to leave immediately. My brother ignored him. He pointed at me, jabbing the air with a trembling finger. She is lying. She always lies. She has always been dramatic. Tell them. Tell them you made it up. Tell them you fall. The words hit me like echoes of every justification my mother had ever used. But here in this garage, surrounded by coworkers who had pulled victims out of real danger and had seen real fear, the excuses did not land. They scattered in the air like dust. I stepped forward slightly, not out of courage, but out of clarity. Do not do this, I said quietly. My voice did not shake. My brother's eyes widened, shocked by the calmness in my tone. Grant stepped between us now. "Sir, you need to leave or I will call the sheriff." My brother laughed the kind of laugh that comes from someone who realizes their power is slipping but refuses to accept it. "Call them," he said. "Call everyone. I have nothing to hide." He had everything to hide, and we all knew it. Before Grant could respond, sheriff deputies appeared in the doorway. Mark must have alerted them the moment my brother entered the building. One deputy called his name firmly. He spun toward them, disbelief flooding his face. "What now?" he shouted. "What did I even do?" The deputy held up a hand. "You were instructed to stay away from this location. This is a violation." My brother's mouth opened and closed as he tried to build a new story, a new explanation, a new distortion. "She is crazy. She is unstable. She wants attention." The deputy did not respond. He simply took a step forward. "Sir, hands behind your back." My brother backed up, bumping into an equipment cart. His bravado cracked, breaking into frantic confusion. "You cannot arrest me here. Not in front of them. Not like this." He looked around the garage at the EMTs and paramedics who stood watching with folded arms and grim, knowing expressions. They were not judging him. They were assessing him, evaluating the risk, seeing him clearly in a way he had never been seen before. His voice faltered. His shoulders slumped. When the deputies cuffed him, he looked at me over his shoulder, pleading and furious all at once. "Say something," he demanded. "Tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them you were emotional. Tell them it was not my fault." For years, that exact tone had forced me into silence. For years, those words had bent me into shapes that did not belong to me. But today, in the place where I spent my days saving strangers surrounded by people who valued truth and safety more than image and excuses, I finally stood upright. I said nothing. My silence was no longer compliance. It was testimony. The deputies guided him toward the exit. His steps were uneven, his breath ragged. The confrontation he had come here to win had become a collapse he had not expected. When the doors closed behind him, the garage stayed quiet for several seconds. Then Jenna stepped beside me. "You did nothing wrong," she said softly. The supervisor added, "If you need time, take it. We've got your back." Those words hit me harder than any blow ever had. Support. Solidarity. Belief. I nodded and exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle inside me like a stone that finally found its proper place. My brother's power had cracked in public for the second time. Not behind closed doors, not within family walls, but here in my world, in my space, in the place where I finally had witnesses who understood truth when they saw it. The retaliation was not over. But something fundamental had shifted. The world was no longer bending around his version of events. It was bending toward mine. The day after the confrontation at the EMS station, I sat in the small conference room at the shelter with a stack of papers spread across the table. The overhead light buzzed softly, blending with the hum of the heater as it pushed warm air into the room. I wrapped my hands around a cup of weak coffee and stared at the documents again, photos of my bruises, screenshots of texts, timestamps, copies of voicemails I had not listened to twice, and a printed list of every police call associated with my family's address in the past year. It felt surreal seeing the evidence laid out like a map of my life, each piece confirming something I had spent years trying to convince myself was not real. The advocate, a woman named Teresa with silver hair pulled into a low ponytail, sat across from me. She tapped a pen lightly on the table. "You already have more documentation than most people manage in months," she said, and her tone carried something close to admiration. I did not feel admirable, just awake. Teresa slid the photos of my ribs and cheek into a clear plastic binder. "These will be included in the packet for the judge. Do not worry about how they look. Do not worry about how you look. Worry about being honest. That is all you have to do." Honesty. I let that word settle. It felt heavier than I expected, shaped by years of being told that honesty was disloyalty. Teresa held up one of the printed voicemails. "When they hear this," she said, "they will understand the escalation. It is exactly the kind of language that shows a risk pattern." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She continued, "You know you will have to speak. Only briefly. But you will." I exhaled slowly. "I know." She leaned forward. "You will be prepared. We will practice. You will not be alone for any part of this." The promise sat warm in the room. For the first time in days, my shoulders loosened slightly. The door opened and my neighbor from across the street stepped inside, hesitantly. Mrs. Howard had lived near my family for more than 20 years. She was small, always wearing knit cardigans, always carrying a faint smell of lavender and peppermint. When she saw me sitting at the table, she pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "I am so sorry I did not call for help sooner." My throat tightened again. Mrs. Howard had been the one who finally called the police that morning. She had been the first witness in my entire life to step in. I stood to greet her. "You did more than anyone else ever did," I whispered. "You did exactly what I needed." She blinked back tears and reached out to squeeze my hand. "I heard things for years," she murmured. "I kept hoping your mother would step in. I thought maybe it was not my place." Her voice cracked. "I will not make that mistake again." Teresa invited her to sit and began reviewing what Mrs. Howard would say in court. "You heard loud impact noises around 2:19 in the morning," Teresa said. "You heard shouting. You saw her brother leaving the house in an agitated state. You saw bruising on Lena's face later that week." Mrs. Howard nodded after each sentence, her expression tightening with determination. "I will not let him intimidate her anymore," she said firmly. After she left, Teresa turned back to me. "She is exactly the kind of witness a judge listens to. Long-term neighbor, no personal drama, no family ties, just truth." My phone buzzed on the table, a message from my mother. I hesitated before tapping it open. It was long and frantic, full of the usual twisting of reality. "Your brother is devastated. You are tearing this family apart. You know how much pressure he has. You know how fragile he is. You cannot do this to him. Family forgives. Family protects each other." Then the last line. "Your grandmother forgave your uncle. Why cannot you forgive your brother?" The generational chain swung heavily around my throat for a moment, then fell away. I typed back a single line. "Because the cycle ends with me." I set the phone face down on the table. Teresa raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" I nodded. For once, it was not a lie. The shelter provided a small side room for practicing court testimony, a simple chair, a recording device, a table meant to simulate where I would sit in front of the judge. Teresa walked me through every step. "State your name. State your relationship to the respondent. State what happened. State the pattern. State the fear. State the evidence." At first, my voice shook. Then it steadied. Then it became something I did not recognize. Something firm. Something clear. After an hour, Teresa switched off the recorder. "You are ready," she said. And when she said it, I believed her. That afternoon, Mark came by the shelter to drop off the final police report, his badge clipped to his belt, his expression softer than usual. He placed the folder on the table. "Everything is in there," he said. "The timestamps match your testimony exactly." His tone carried no hesitation. "No doubt." When he stood to leave, he paused. "You know, getting a protective order is not just paperwork. It is a line in the sand. Once it is drawn, he cannot come near you. And if he tries..." Mark let the sentence hang in the air. Then he finished quietly. "We enforce it." He gave a small nod, then left. I stayed in the empty room for several minutes, staring at the binder, the witness statements, the photos, the transcripts, the official report. My entire life distilled into evidence of something I once tried to pretend was normal. I closed the binder slowly. The preparation was finished. The cycle had been documented. The truth had been assembled piece by piece. And tomorrow the judge would see what my family had never allowed themselves to see. That it was real. That it had always been real. And that I was ready to speak it out loud. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The kind of cold that seeped into you from polished floors and echoing hallways, and the soft shuffle of people waiting for decisions that could reshape their entire lives. I walked beside Teresa, holding the binder against my chest like a shield. Each step felt deliberate, heavy with the weight of everything that had brought me here. My throat was dry, but my mind was clear. This was the moment the cycle would finally face the light. The courtroom was small, with rows of wooden benches and a single tall window letting in a slice of pale winter sun. I sat at the petitioner's table. Teresa sat beside me. The judge had not yet entered, but the deputy standing near the door nodded reassuringly when he saw me. That alone steadied my breathing. Across the aisle, the door opened and my brother walked in. His hands were free, but the discomfort on his face showed he felt the absence of control more sharply than any cuff. He wore a pressed shirt too stiff for him, and his hair was combed in a way he never bothered with unless he wanted to look like the innocent one. He scanned the room until his eyes found mine. There was no rage in them today, only disbelief. Disbelief that we were here. Disbelief that he was not in charge. My mother followed behind him, clutching her purse like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. When she saw me, her face twisted with hurt, not the kind inflicted by real pain, but the kind produced by wounded pride. She whispered to him loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "She is confused. She just needs reassurance." My brother sat down beside his attorney, a man who appeared calm in the way someone might be if they visited this courtroom 5 times a week. His attorney leaned in and said something quietly, but my brother's gaze stayed fixed on me, burning with a silent plea. Or accusation. I could not tell. The bailiff called everyone rise. The judge entered. She was a middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her hair and an expression carved from years of hearing too many stories like mine. She sat, we followed, and the room went still. "This is a hearing for a protective order," she began. "The petitioner may proceed." Teresa nudged me gently. I rose my knees stiff and stepped forward. The judge looked at me with steady eyes. "When you are ready," she said. My voice began softly. "My name is Lena. I am 28. The judge nodded. I continued. "I am here because there has been a long pattern of violence and intimidation from my brother." As I spoke, I watched my mother shake her head, slowly mouthing, "No," as if denial could rewrite history in real time. I kept going. The judge instructed me to describe one incident that represented the pattern. I chose the most recent morning. I described the hit, the shove against the table, my mother's minimization, the night-long fear that settled into something sharper, the evidence I collected. Each sentence landed quietly in the room. Not dramatic, not sensational, just honest. Teresa handed the judge the binder. The judge opened it, studying each photo with a seriousness that made my chest loosen. She flipped through the pages, the timestamps, the voicemails written out, the screenshots. She paused on the photo of my cheek. Then she nodded and looked at me again. "Thank you. You may sit." I exhaled and returned to my seat. The judge turned to the responding party. "Does the respondent wish to speak?" My brother's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client maintains that these events are misunderstandings. He claims his sister bruises easily and tends to exaggerate emotional situations." The judge did not even blink. "Do you have evidence?" she asked calmly. The attorney hesitated, flipping through his folder. He produced nothing. My brother finally spoke, his voice cracking under the strain. "She makes everything sound worse than it is. She has always been dramatic. She falls. She bumps into things. She does things to make me look bad. She always has." The judge did not look at him. Instead, she turned to my mother. "Are you intending to testify, ma'am?" My mother stood quickly, smoothing her blouse. "Yes. I would like to say that my children have always fought. This is normal sibling behavior. Lena has a tendency to make episodes seem far more intense than they were. She can be emotional." The judge raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Ma'am, I am going to ask you something clearly. Have you personally witnessed the respondent strike or shove your daughter?" The silence was instant and suffocating. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Every lie she had ever used suddenly did not fit. Finally, she whispered, "I was just trying to keep the peace." The judge tapped her pen once on the desk. "That is not an answer." My mother swallowed and sat down slowly. The judge turned back to the binder, then to the police reports, then to my neighbor's statement. Finally, she faced the courtroom fully. "The pattern is clear," she said. "Long-term, documented, supported by witness testimony, increasing in severity." The room seemed to tilt slightly. The judge picked up her pen. "The court grants the petitioner a full protective order for a period of 2 years. Full stay-away order. No contact of any kind. The respondent is prohibited from approaching her home workplace or any shelter facility." My brother inhaled sharply. His mouth opened as if to protest, but the judge continued firmly. "Any violation will result in immediate arrest and additional charges." My mother stared at the table, her face pale. My brother's jaw tightened. His eyes darted to me one last time, full of disbelief and a grief I did not recognize. A grief for the version of himself he could no longer force the world to believe in. The bailiff announced, "Court is adjourned." The judge stood and left. And in the silence that followed, something inside me finally quietly broke open. Not pain, not fear, relief. A relief so deep it felt like breathing air for the first time in years. I gathered my binder and rose slowly. My brother did not look at me again. My mother did not call my name, and I walked out of that courtroom knowing the cycle had met its first real consequence, knowing the truth had finally been seen, and knowing that from here on out, everything would be different. 2 days after the court hearing, I returned to my mother's house for the last time, accompanied by 2 officers who walked beside me with the steady presence of people who understood exactly why someone like me should not have to do this alone. The winter air was sharp, carrying the faint smell of chimney smoke from neighboring homes, and the crunch of gravel under our boots followed us up the driveway. I paused for a moment at the front door, staring at the familiar wood grain, remembering how many nights I had pressed my ear against this very surface, trying to predict the direction of anger, the volume of footsteps, the shape of danger. One officer nodded gently. "You take the lead," he said. "We are right here." I opened the door. The house looked smaller than I remembered, as if the walls themselves had shrunk the moment the truth entered them. My mother stood in the living room, clutching a folded dish towel in her hands like a fragile offering. She looked older, tired, or perhaps I was seeing her without the haze of loyalty I had worn like a veil for years. She opened her mouth as if to greet me, but the presence of the officers kept her words tangled in her throat. I walked past her. Today was not about reconciliation. Today was about retrieval, about closure, about reclaiming every piece of myself I had left scattered in this place. I entered my bedroom, the same room I had grown up in, the same room where quiet fear had slept beside me for years. The walls were pale blue, the paint slightly chipped near the corner where a bookshelf had once stood. My suitcase lay open on the bed. I folded my clothes methodically, stacking them with care, not because they were precious, but because this small act of order anchored me. One of the officers stood outside the door, giving me distance, but remaining close enough that I never felt alone. As I packed, memories rose like dust disturbed by movement. The quiet flashbacks came not as scenes of pain, but as moments of smallness, the countless ways I had been taught that my comfort mattered less. I found the old photo album my mother kept on the lowest shelf, the one filled with years of birthdays, holidays, graduations. I flipped through it slowly, my brother always in the center of each frame, beaming with confidence. My mother beside him, hand on his shoulder, and me in the edges, cropped, shadowed, diminished. I closed the album and slid it into my suitcase anyway. Not because I wanted to keep the past, but because it belonged to me and I was done leaving pieces of my story behind. When I stepped back into the hallway, my mother hovered near the stairs. Her eyes were wet, but they held none of the softness I used to long for. Only confusion, only disbelief that the child who had once bent to every expectation was standing fully upright now. She finally spoke. "You are abandoning your family." Her voice quivered. I let the words sit in the space between us for a moment before answering. "I am not abandoning anyone. I am leaving the cycle you refused to break." She flinched as if the truth had weight. Maybe it did. Maybe truth always weighs more than lies because it carries generations on its back. She shook her head slowly. "Your grandmother forgave." I cut her off gently. "And it destroyed her. and then it destroyed you. I will not let it destroy me." Her shoulders slumped. For a flicker of a second, I saw something in her eyes that looked like recognition, the faintest spark of a woman who maybe once wanted to break free, but never learned how. But the spark faded just as quickly. She stepped back, gripping the railing as though the truth might knock her off balance. I walked toward the kitchen, the officers following at a respectful distance. The kitchen was exactly as I remembered. The table where I had been shoved, the counter where I had learned to brace myself, the window I used to stare out of, wondering if anyone would ever see what was happening inside this house. I placed my last bag near the door and zipped it shut. One officer cleared his throat softly. "Do you need anything else?" I looked around the room, my eyes scanning the corners where old fear once hid. "No," I said. "I have everything I need." As we prepared to leave, my mother appeared again, blocking the doorway for a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do not abandon your brother. He needs us." And there it was, the plea of a mother who could not see past generational loyalty long enough to understand the damage it had caused. For the first time, I felt no guilt, no pull, no ache of responsibility. I felt something else. Clarity. I met her eyes. "You abandoned me first. Every time you chose his comfort over my safety. Every time you excused his harm. Every time you told me to stay quiet." The officers waited patiently as my words settled like dust in the quiet room. My mother's lips parted as if to argue, but nothing came out. Silence filled the space. Not the oppressive silence of old fear, but the clean silence of truth finally spoken. I stepped past her. The officers followed. The cold air outside hit my face sharp and honest. I walked down the steps without looking back. Not because I was heartless, but because I was finally whole. The door closed behind me with a soft thud. It did not sound like loss. It sounded like the end of something that had needed to end for a long, long time. I lifted my bags into the patrol car, exhaled slowly, and whispered to myself words that felt like a promise. The cycle is closed, and I am free. The transitional apartment they placed me in was small, barely larger than a studio, but when I unlocked the door for the first time and stepped inside, the quiet felt completely different from any silence I had ever known. It was not the tight, breathless quiet of my mother's house. It was not the listening quiet I used to endure at night, waiting for footsteps or anger. This quiet was open, gentle, a clean slate where the walls held no memory of raised voices or swallowed tears. I stood in the doorway for a full minute before moving, letting the stillness settle around me like a soft blanket. The living area held a small couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a window looking out toward a row of leafless trees. Beyond the kitchen counter was a single bedroom. The bed neatly made the sheets crisp and smelling faintly of detergent. I placed my bags inside and stepped back, staring at the space that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right. For the first time in my life, I would sleep in a place where no one told me to stay small. That realization made my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from the shock of something I had never allowed myself to imagine. Freedom feels foreign when you have lived inside a cage for so long. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes in the dresser, setting my photo album on the nightstand, arranging my shoes in a neat row by the closet. Each small act felt ceremonial, as if I were planting markers to claim the ground beneath me. When I finished, the room looked lived in. Not by a survivor, but by a person. Just a person. The next day, I attended my first one-on-one therapy session at the shelter. The therapist, Dr. Mason, was a calm woman with steady hands and an even steadier voice. She invited me to sit on a couch beside a small table covered with tissues, fidget toys, and a lamp with a soft yellow glow. She asked how I was feeling. The question was so simple that it nearly disarmed me. I hesitated before answering. "Lighter," I said, "but fragile, like I am learning how to walk again." "That is exactly what healing feels like," she said. We talked first about the cycle, not just the violence, but the favoritism, the silence, the generational weight handed down like an heirloom. She explained how patterns form long before people realize they are participating in them. "Your mother repeated what her mother taught her," she said. "She survived by normalizing it, but you are ending it by acknowledging it." The word ending felt powerful. heavy, beautiful. In the next session, Dr. Mason asked me to describe what safety looked like to me, not in theory, but in sensation. I closed my eyes. Safety feels like having enough space to breathe, like not listening for footsteps, like a room that stays quiet because it wants to, not because it is waiting. She nodded. That is your benchmark now. Anything that does not feel like that is not for you. For the first time, I had a benchmark, a reference point for a life worth choosing. That week, I began attending the group meetings more regularly. The circle of women shifted each day, some new faces, some familiar. There was comfort in the routine of passing the talking piece around the room. When it reached me one afternoon, I held it gently and said, I am learning that my story did not start with him. It started long before me. But it will end with me. The group nodded in a quiet wave of recognition. Healing is not measured by how loudly someone speaks. Sometimes it is measured by the softness that finally returns to their voice. On Friday, the shelter hosted a small workshop on reclaiming space. The exercise was simple. Draw a room that represents your future, a room that belongs only to you. I drew a round table. The image appeared in my mind before I even realized why. A round table means equality, Dr. Mason said when she passed by. No one sits at the head. No one sits at the edge. Her words struck a chord so deep that my hand trembled slightly. I remembered every holiday where my brother sat at the center and I hovered near the wall. Every dinner where my mother placed the best pieces of food on his plate and handed me the leftovers. Every moment where their comfort mattered more than my presence. A round table. Every seat equal. Every voice level. Every person seen. The symbolism was so simple, so profound, that it became the first real purchase I wanted for my new life. A few days later, I walked into a small thrift store and found exactly what I had drawn. A modest wooden table with a smooth surface and 4 matching chairs. I ran my hand across it and felt something warm settle inside me. I bought it with the first paycheck I had earned since leaving home. When the delivery men set it up in my apartment, the space felt instantly different. Balanced. Whole. Mine. That evening, I made dinner for myself, just a simple bowl of pasta with garlic and butter, and sat at the table alone. But I did not feel lonely. I felt steady, present, upright. Healing is not a dramatic moment. It is a series of small, quiet choices repeated over and over until they become your life. I washed my dish afterward, turned off the kitchen light, and paused in the doorway of my bedroom. The room glowed softly in the lamplight. My bruises were fading. My breath was easy. My mind was still no longer running through survival scripts. I whispered to myself the words I had not said aloud before. I deserve this. Not a house, not furniture, not even peace. I deserve a life where I do not have to apologize for surviving. And as I slipped into bed, pulling the soft blanket over my legs, I realized the healing had not just begun. It had roots now. It had direction. It had me. 1 year later, I stood in the small kitchen of my apartment at 6:23 in the morning, watching the first strands of sunlight stretch across the round wooden table I had bought during my earliest days of healing. The table had become the quiet heart of my home, the place where I drank coffee, read books, filled out paperwork, laughed with new friends, and slowly stitched myself back into someone whole. The apartment around me looked lived in now, warm in a way I had never experienced growing up. A soft throw draped across the couch. A shelf of mismatched mugs collected from thrift stores. A potted plant thriving in the corner despite my inconsistent watering. I cracked 2 eggs into a pan, listening to the gentle sizzle. This was the first anniversary of the morning everything changed. The morning guests. The moment the cycle finally cracked open and the truth stepped into the room. I felt the echo of that day in the way the sunlight drifted across the counter, in the way my ribs expanded freely with every breath, in the way my hands moved without trembling. A knock sounded lightly on my door. 3 soft taps, the kind that did not demand, did not threaten, did not claim. I smiled and wiped my hands on a towel before opening the door. Jenna stood there holding a container of cinnamon rolls, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her EMS hoodie zipped halfway up. "Morning," she said. I brought bribery. Come in. I laughed, letting her inside. She placed the container on the table and inhaled dramatically. Smells exactly like healing, she joked. You and your poetic metaphors, I said, nudging her shoulder. She shrugged. This is a big day. 1 year free day should have pastries. A few minutes later, Mark arrived carrying a bag of coffee from the local shop. He gave a small nod in greeting before placing the cups on the table. He was still the same steady presence, still speaking in short sentences that carried more weight than paragraphs. Proud of you, he said quietly. His voice had not changed, but my ability to accept the words had. Thank you. While we ate, conversation drifted easily. Jenna told an outrageous story about a patient who insisted his broken toe was a government conspiracy. Mark rolled his eyes in that dry way of his. I laughed more freely than I ever had in my childhood home. With every breath, the apartment felt fuller, richer, anchored by people who cared without conditions or generational scripts. Around 8, there was another knock at the door. Mrs. Howard stood there with a plate wrapped in foil. Her cardigan was buttoned crookedly as always, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun. I brought muffins, she said. I overbaked them, but they are made with love. My throat tightened with warmth. Please come in, I said. She stepped inside and looked around approvingly. You have made such a nice home. I told her quietly I could not have done it without you. She shook her head. Honey, I only made a phone call. You did the rest. That was not true, but I let her believe it. After everyone settled around the round table, I stood for a moment, letting my eyes travel from face to face. Mark sipping his coffee with quiet contentment. Jenna grinning as she sliced a cinnamon roll in half. Mrs. Howard adjusting her cardigan, humming softly. This was my morning now, mine by choice, mine by truth, mine by survival. When the room fell into a comfortable silence, I spoke. 1 year ago today, I said softly, officers knocked on my door. Everything changed in minutes. Everything I thought was permanent, cracked. I looked down at my hands resting on the back of a chair. I used to think survival meant staying silent. That silence kept me safe. But it only kept the cycle alive. The room listened with a softness that made my voice steady. I took a slow breath. I said nothing that morning, but the world finally heard me. No one interrupted. No one minimized. No one redirected the blame. After a moment, I sat down again as warmth gathered behind my eyes. Mrs. Howard reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. You broke it, she said. The chain, the cycle. You broke it. The words settled into me like the final piece of something long unfinished. Later that morning, after everyone left, I walked to a small park a few blocks away. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that wakes you gently. I found a bench with a view of the frozen lake and sat pulling my coat tighter around me. People walked their dogs. Children chased each other near the swings. Life moved on around me in soft, ordinary waves. I pulled out the notebook Dr. Mason had encouraged me to keep. On the first page, I had written a sentence during one of our early sessions. What ends with you? Under it, I had listed 3 words. Silence, fear, favoritism. I traced my fingertips over the ink. I had not realized when I wrote those words that they would become a blueprint for rebuilding my life. I closed the notebook slowly and looked out over the lake. Sunlight hit the ice, scattering in bright shards like pieces of something once broken, now catching the light instead of hiding in the dark. I breathed in deeply. My chest did not tighten. My shoulders did not tense. I felt steady, present, alive in a way I had not been for decades. Healing does not erase the past. It redefines it. And 1 year later, the morning that once froze, everything had become the morning that thawed my whole life. I stood from the bench, tucked the notebook under my arm, and whispered into the cold air, not as a promise, but as a truth finally rooted inside me. I did not just survive. I rebuilt. If you are still here with me at this last part of my story, then maybe you recognize pieces of yourself somewhere in these 12 months of unraveling and rebuilding. Maybe you know the sound of holding your breath in your own home, or the weight of being told to keep the peace while someone else destroys it. Maybe you grew up in a family where one person was always protected and another was always blamed. Maybe you learned to stay quiet because speaking felt dangerous or pointless, Or like screaming into a locked room. Or maybe you learned to disappear in small ways so someone else could shine in big ones. I know that story. I lived it. And if you are nodding right now, if your shoulders are tightening or your jaw is clenching because the memories sit too close to the surface, I want you to know this without hesitation. You are not imagining it. You are not dramatic. You are not the problem. And you were never meant to carry the weight of an entire family on your back simply because they told you it was your role. If silence has been your survival tool, I understand that more deeply than I can ever explain. Silence kept me alive for years. Silence helped me read danger like weather. Silence taught me when to step aside, when to stay still, and when to pretend nothing happened. But silence also kept the cycle unbroken until the morning I finally realized that my quiet was not just fear anymore. It was preparation. When the officers knocked on the door that day, everything inside me shifted. Not because the danger vanished, but because I finally had proof that I was not crazy, that my pain was real, that someone would stand between me and the person who claimed to love me. If you are watching this in a house where you are afraid to move too quickly or speak too loudly, I want to say something to you gently but clearly. You deserve safety. Not conditional safety, not safety that depends on someone else being in a good mood. Not safety that comes only after the storm passes. You deserve safety that stays. You deserve mornings where the light hits your face and you do not flinch. You deserve to breathe without calculating who might hear it. You deserve a life where your worth is not measured against someone else's comfort. And if you walked away even once, if you hid for a night, if you called a friend, if you saved screenshots, if you told a stranger, if you whispered your truth into the dark, even when no one seemed to hear it, I want you to know you are already breaking the cycle. Healing is not loud. Sometimes it begins in a whisper. Sometimes it begins in a shelter bed. Sometimes it begins in a courtroom where your hands shake so badly you can barely hold your statement. And sometimes it begins in the smallest decision to stay somewhere safe for one more night. If you are someone who got out, I am proud of you in ways you may not feel yet. If you are someone who still cannot leave, I am not here to judge you. I know what it means to have reasons so heavy they feel welded to your ribs. I know what it means to think leaving will make things worse. And I know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply survive until the right morning comes. My story is not unique. I wish it were. But because it is not, I want to ask you something now. Not for views, not for numbers, but because someone reading the comments might desperately need to see proof that they are not alone. Where are you watching from? Tell me your city, your state, your country. Tell me your local time right now. The time on your phone the minute you hear these words. Because when survivors speak in the same space, even from different corners of the world, the silence breaks a little more. And if you feel comfortable, tell me this too. Have you ever been silenced by the people who should have protected you? Did you grow up in a house where favoritism shaped every conversation? Did you spend years shrinking so someone else could stay comfortable? And most importantly, when did you finally speak, or if you have not spoken yet, what would you want to say if you could? Your answer might be the things someone else needs to believe their story matters. You do not need to share details. You do not need to reveal more than you want. Even a single sentence might help a stranger breathe easier tonight. Maybe something like, I understand, or I survived, or I am trying, or I am still here. Sometimes those words can be a lifeline. And if you have no words yet, if everything still feels tangled and raw, that is okay too. Healing does not ask for performance. It asks for honesty. Before you scroll away from this video, before you close the app and go back to whatever waits for you, I want you to know this last thing plainly. You deserve a morning that belongs to you. A morning where fear does not decide your tone of voice or your heartbeat or your future. A morning where your silence is no longer a shield, but a choice. If you are still waiting for that morning, keep going. It will come. And when it does, you will know. Now tell me the most important part. Where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Someone who needs your courage might be waiting to see you.